this working? Can I get some feedback? Perfect. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now coming to the session on improving our visions of the future. I think from the morning you have already heard about the importance of foresight. Let me just put it a bit in context. We have, at the last GFAR, clearly detected that we have a fractured system. We have research doing their thing, extension, investment, other things. But we are now saying, and that was the conclusion, we need to coordinate a lot better. Now, to coordinate across institutions, obviously having some sort of common vision of where you want to go, I could imagine you would agree, is helpful. Now, what further complicates matters is that the world is changing very rapidly. The context in which we have to work is changing, and thus again, there is a huge premium on understanding these changes and seeing where they're going to take us, particularly when you're talking, as we are here, about research. Research is investing in solutions for the future, so you have to have a sense of where that future is going to be to try to make reasonable investments. So, I will basically posit that the hypothesis of this session here is that in order to achieve what we want as the international community in terms of addressing poverty, in terms of having impact, having clearer foresight, more effective mechanisms of sharing foresight is absolutely critical. We want your views in this session to tell us if this is correct and if we're on the right path or whatever other ideas you may have. Now, we are being webcast, so we're going to combine the web with your interventions. I will really ask you all to be short and to the point. We really want to make this an interactive session. And this is why I'm stopping right here, and I'm going to hand over to Robin Bourgeois from GFAR. He will give an initial overview, and then we'll go into case studies. Robin?
That's my paper.
I don't want to take that away.
Thank you, Carlos. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here, standing in front of you and presenting the state of foresight and in food and agriculture. I just want to apologize. I have a sore throat, and I hope that my voice will be audible for all of you. First point, I would like to emphasize why we are here today and why we are talking about foresight. Actually, if we refer to the GCARD roadmap, I highlighted two quotes from which you may see the bold letters there, which is what we want to focus in this meeting with you. So we want to focus on forward-looking anticipatory research and analysis. We want to focus on things that are directly integrating the diverse views of farmers and other stakeholders. And we want to focus on approaches that enable us to use multiple lenses when we are dealing with problems of the future. The GCARD roadmap tells us also that in order to do this, we need to mobilize experts and analyses within the countries at various levels, that we can do that by bringing together this analysis through different mechanisms facilitated, among others, by the GFAR and the regional fora, in order to have these diverse and national and international initiatives brought together and also to bring together different models and perspectives. Yeah, but if I stay in front of the mic, I can't use my paper. Okay. The telephone. Switch off. Okay. Just put it here. Okay. Thank you. Now, let's start. I will just tell you what I'm going to present. First, I will present some elements to be shared with you so that we can work together during these foresight sessions, not only this afternoon, but also tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. But this afternoon, we want to develop a common understanding and a common language about foresight. Then I will go through an inventory that we have undertaken in order to provide you some updates about the state of foresight in agriculture right now. And that will be followed by a short presentation of the framework of the next session. So, in defining foresight, there are many diverse definitions, but I'm suggesting here that we are using one that has been proposed by the European Union because they have done a lot of foresight work and they have also conducted an inventory of foresight activities in Europe and worldwide across different sectors. From that inventory, they came to a definition of foresight, which is a process combining three elements. One of these elements is a long-term vision, a long-term approach. Another one is the inclusion of priority setting and policy making into the process of foresight. And the third one is doing this in a participative approach so that we can engage all stakeholders and different sources of knowledge. So the working definition that we propose to use here, which is consistent also with the message from the roadmap, is that for us, in these sessions, foresight will be the equivalent of forward-looking anticipatory research and analysis. So that's the first element of common language that we are suggesting here. Now, why do people or organizations, does it work? Sorry. Okay. Why do people or organizations engage in foresight? Well, actually it is possible to define at least three main objectives. One is to produce knowledge, one is to develop interaction about how we can build our future together, and the third one is about what we can do to create, to make it happen. And that obviously, those objectives depend very much on who is engaging in foresight. Scientists, governments, private companies, civil sector organizations may have different objectives when they are engaging in foresight. What is important is to see here that there is not one single way, not one single normative way of doing foresight. A diversity is needed. And remember about foresight that is not about predicting the future, it's about creating it. That's too fast. Okay. Now, getting a bit more in the details so that we know exactly what we are talking about, what the foresight practitioners tell us about foresight in terms of methods is diversity. And diversity is, again, a key word here. If we look, for example, at this diagram here, you can see more than 30 different tools that can be used in order to develop foresight activities. Of course, I'm not asking you to read them one by one, but what is important here is to see that those different tools are combining to some extent four dimensions, which are very important to keep in mind when we are talking about foresight. It's creativity, it is about expertise, interaction, and evidence. And we need still methodological advances in foresight, this is what the foresight practitioner says, in order to further strengthen our credibility when we are doing foresight works by combining this evidence, creativity, interaction, and expertise. Now, when we are looking at the practices, there is a family of foresight works which are developing analysis based on the trends, based on the likely evolution of the futures based on our current situations. So this is usually what the quantitative methods used in foresight are working on. But there is also a family of methods which are trying to anticipate, explore, identify potential ruptures from these trends so that we are not just looking at the likely things, but also at the unlikely things. And together, they contribute to build what we can call the plausible futures. And the plausible futures can be explored even better when we marry these different families of methods. So this is also a message that we can convey here, that we need to integrate different approaches, different tools, in order to better understand what are the challenges and what are the stakes in the future. Now I'm going to the second part of my presentation, which is about the inventory that we have conducted recently in order to document and inform you better about the current state of foresight. So this inventory Started with a consultation, a survey, better speaking, a survey of more than 5,000 people and organizations. We got answers, we analyzed these answers, and as Professor Monty Jones said this morning, we had more than 40 cases that we selected and identified as Foresight works related with agriculture and rural development, from which we were able to develop an analysis and synthesize the lessons learned. Most of this work, you have it in your USB, your US pen drives that you have in your bags. The briefs on the Foresight, the reports which I am presenting here, everything is in your documents. So if you want further information, please read them. I'm just providing here a synthesis, a very extracts of the key messages that we want to provide today based on this inventory. Now, what do we learn from this inventory in terms of challenges and controversy? First, in terms of challenges, we have seen that most of the Foresight work have a focus on food security. And actually, it happens that what they say about food security is that the availability of food is not so much the problem. The problem is more related with the access to food. And access to food is very likely to be one of the key future challenges for agriculture and rural development. These works indicate also that access to food is not just a problem of logistics, something like moving products from a surplus area to a deficit area. It's not just that could be solved by market. It is also an issue related with the capacity for people to acquire the quality and the quality of food and the quantity of food that they need, either producing it or purchasing it. The second challenge that we identified through this work is what we call the farming world questions. Who will be farming, or who would be farming in the future? What will happen with the farmers? What would happen with employment? And more generally, with the future of rural societies? How could we achieve more sustainable societies? Conservation of local culture? What would be the impact of increasing urbanization of agriculture? All these questions are new challenges that we need to explore and better anticipate through Foresight. Another one that clearly came out from this analysis is that the policies and societal values cannot just consider as external factors. They are drivers of changes. And that means that one of the challenges for future Foresight will be to integrate more systematically those new drivers related with policies and societal values in the analysis, in addition to the factors that we have already considered as important. And we need also to understand better how societal values, how policy could evolve in the future. Another set of challenges is that we need also to question we need to explore alternatives to productivity as a response to all the stakes that we identified in the future. So technology-based farm productivity increase is part of the answer, but what we see from this work, it is not likely to be the only and only feasible answer. Other dimensions have to be incorporated. We also have seen that the consumer's behavior and how the consumer's behavior may change is an important element to take into consideration in order to understand the link between people, profit, and planet, as it is said in one of the briefs which is in your documents. And finally, we learned from this inventory that we need to take account more for diversity, taking into consideration variations at local, national level, as different, multiple drivers lead to different situations. We need to better integrate what we can identify and analyze at the global level with what we can learn from the regional, national, and local level and combine them. Now, let's see some controversies, and I hope that will help to foster some debates. I will mention 6 controversies. 2 are related with the evolution of farming patterns. Are we going to have, oops, what happened here? Okay. Are we going to have larger, more concentrated farms, or smaller, more diversified farms? or something else, completely different, that we cannot even think about right now because it's different from what we know. But probably we can anticipate changes leading us to different directions. So this is what we need to explore. The controversy is there for that. Another one is about how would food security be ensured? By family farmers or by large industrial farms or by something else that we don't know yet and that we need to explore. Then when we are talking about how agricultural land will be used in the future or could be used in the future, then we have several controversies. Will we have more agricultural land or less? Will we have land used for multifunctional purpose or highly specialized lands? And in general, how will the rural area evolve? Will they be desertified with nobody left there, or they will be revitalized, or something else? I mean, those things are big uncertainties that we need to explore through foresight methods, because those are the challenges of the future. And finally, another controversy that came from this analysis of these works is about the linkage between consumption and production, and in particular, the question about whether we are heading towards the standardization of consumption patterns and food supplied by international market, which in turn will shape how agricultural products are produced, or will we have a more, let's say, regional and diversified consumption patterns that can be sustained by local production system, or something else. So this is again a field that we need to explore with foresight in order to better inform stakeholders, decision makers about the options and potentially the choices they have to make to head towards the future that we want. Now, this is about the content of this work. Now let's just take a quick look at the process, how foresight has been practiced, because this is also important to see to what extent we have moved towards improved foresight as indicated in the GCARD roadmap. And for that purpose, I will just show you, let's say, one slide, no more, saying that first, we have a lot of foresight which has been done at the global level, at the international level. Usually, but not all, more, let's say, quantitative and less inclusive, but there are exceptions, but with a striking point, which is that the least developing countries are almost absent in the leadership and the realization of foresight works on one hand, and on the other hand, that the farmers' organizations, the civil society organization, and non-governmental organizations, with a few exceptions, are not initiating or are not leader in the initiatives for undertaking foresight analysis, while one might consider it as a paradoxically thing, since this is about their future. Now, let's see why we are talking about foresight also, because foresight has an impact. What we have learned from the inventory, based on evidence provided by the authors of these cases that we have analyzed, and of course I'm not bringing the evidence here because there's a mountain of documents here, but we have evidence that foresight can influence the stakeholders, and it can influence stakeholders in different ways. When it is about producing knowledge, then it influences by raising awareness, by raising attention, by fostering debates. But some cases also we have evidence that foresight work have been able to influence and have an impact on policies by changing decisions made by stakeholders. And that happened both internally, for example, when an organization commissioned internally a foresight or engaged in a foresight for its own strategic thinking, but also externally when outside organizations are promoting or sponsoring foresight works in order to better understand what might happen in the future. And the capacity to have an impact is very much also linked with the capacity of the foresight leaders to engage directly with stakeholders at a level where they can turn the foresight options that I highlighted into actionable measures, into policies, into implementation. And we will have a couple of cases after this presentation which will witness this. Still, impact evaluation is needed. Almost, let's say, we have identified 2 or 3 of 40 foresight works which have in their design an impact evaluation process. And it needs to be more evidenced here that impact that foresight has an impact. Otherwise, a lot of people might ask, why are we engaging in these future things when we don't see the immediate effects today? And that's something that can be documented because there is evidence of impact. Now, I will have my last 2 slides, because I think I'm in time, Mr. Chair. Is that okay? What can we do together? And it's just an introduction, because first, what we can do together is to have a common language. And this is what we are trying to do in this session right now. We can also have more in-depth discussion, which is what we will do in the next session tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon, in order to find out what kind of commitments we can have collectively in order to improve foresight. So let's go to what we are doing during the GCARD Foresight session, and this is also my introduction to the next presentation, but also the next session. So just after my presentation, we will have 5 illustrative cases which will show you the diversity of approaches at various scales from the international to the local level using quantitative and qualitative methods, demonstrating the impact that foresight work may have directly on development and policies. After that, we will have a presentation on the Global Foresight Hub, which has already been briefly introduced this morning by several speakers, and then you will have a better understanding of what is thought through this Foresight Hub. And then we will have a debate, an interactive debate, as Carlos said, with the people outside and inside. And tomorrow morning, we will focus on how foresight will guide or can guide research priorities at the regional level on one hand. This is the first parallel session. And the second parallel session will be about global international foresight, how it can guide research and help research to be more responsive to future development needs and more focused on farmer conditions. And in the afternoon, after we speak about the content in the morning, in the afternoon we will speak about the process. And we will have here 2 parallel sessions, one on how can we develop equitable partnership in foresight so that the voices of all the stakeholders can be included in the works that we are doing about the future and then shape the priorities of research, innovation system and policies. And the second one will be about what kind of capacity needs to be developed in order to ensure that this partnership will work. Thank you very much for your attention. I would just want to thank also all the colleagues who have helped me in doing this inventory, commenting it, providing inputs. Thank you to you all. Yeah, okay. And now I'm going to leave this one and try to find out how we can put Jerry's presentation. Yeah, here you go. There you are, Jerry.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry Nelson. I'm from the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I lead a program there that's currently called the Global Futures Project, which I'll say a little bit about in this presentation. So the first question when you start to think about doing a foresight activity is to ask why you're doing the foresight activity. Who are the users, and what is the question or questions that you're trying to answer? So why the Global Futures Project? It's a simple question. It relates to the CGIAR and about how the CGIAR sets its research priorities. Many of the individual institutions in the organization or the set of organizations have set up priority setting exercises internally. But in fact, the tools to reach across the CGIAR and compare different kinds of outputs from the centers were actually lacking. And so the goal of this exercise was to answer this question or provide the tools to help answer this question. If an investor provides an additional certain sum of money to the CGIAR, how should it be spent to achieve the greatest return on investment? As an economist, of course, the first thing I think about is financial rate of return. But I think if we stop there, we make a big mistake. We need to think about other important social issues, reductions in poverty, effects on various measures of human well-being. But also we need to think about environmental effects, so improvements in sustainability, effects on ecosystem services. So that's what the Global Futures Project was designed to do. We're about 3 years into it. Let me give you a few of the features of what we developed as part of the project. So one of ways in which economists in the past have tried to address this question of return on research is to do what's called a Delphi. And I saw the word Delphi, Robin, in your presentation up there earlier. So that's the ask the experts approach. What we tried to do was to go beyond the typical Delphi process, which was to say, well, I think I can achieve a 0.5% increase in yields if you give me $10 million, to asking the scientists to actually say, what are the physiological changes? In the first instance, we're focusing on crops, but livestock is part of it, as well as management systems. And so we're calling this the virtual crop method. So we ask the experts not just what they think they can accomplish in a yield growth perspective, but also what they think they can accomplish technically. We convert those responses into software equivalents of them, crop model or animal model coefficients. And then we use that software to grow this virtual variety everywhere around the world at very high spatial resolution, and then evaluate its performance relative to existing varieties in existing conditions in those locations. But that's not just for today, it's also for the future. One of the key things that we do is to integrate biophysical, as you see here at the bottom part of this figure, where we take into account things like planting months and climatic conditions, soil characteristics, and management practices, with the socioeconomics. So the biophysical provides the shocks that go into the socioeconomic system, the changes that come as a result or could come as a result of investments in new technology. So that affects our performance in food production units that's the impact model terminology, what yields are, what the area changes are, and then how that interacts with supply and demand to influence international prices, production, consumption, and then various measures of human well-being, calorie availability, percentage of children that are malnourished, and how that might change. So this is really, you might think of this as just kind of ex-ante analysis, and it is, but of course ex-ante analysis really is about assessing plausible futures. And why do we do scenarios? Why do we do foresight? Because, the future is an uncertain place. So let me give you a couple of examples of that in the context of how we're doing this modeling. So here's an example of two outputs from the GCMs, the global general circulation models that attempt to say what climate might be like in the future. These are average temperature changes between 2000 and 2050. Both of these GCMs have exactly the same inputs into them, that is, how much greenhouse gases are there going to be in each one of these years going forward. And they give you very different outcomes in terms of changes in temperature between now and 2050. The reds are high increases in temperatures, and the light blues are small increases in temperatures. These effects then can be translated into outcomes for, in this particular figure, grain-fed maize around the world. So that with this CSIRO, it's an Australian model with the A1B pathway for greenhouse gas emissions, what you can see is that there are some declines in yields. Those are the yellows and the reds. There are actually a few places that might have increases in yields. And that's because the GCM outputs in this particular case have small increases in precipitation, but also relatively small increases in temperature. Contrast that with this figure, which comes from the Japanese MIROC model, also again exactly the same greenhouse gas emissions. And what you find is that this model has more average precipitation on land, but it distributes it very differently. So look at the Corn Belt, for example. You can see a big blob of red there, which means a big decline in maize yields in the United States, a critical maize producing area. And you'll see that other parts of the world have very different effects than what you had with the other models. So this is one example of the uncertainties that we need to take into account as we look into the future. We're going to transition this project into a program as part of the reformed CGIAR. Because we need to institutionalize, as Robin was saying earlier, we need to institutionalize these processes, first of all, about thinking about plausible futures, but also then thinking across the various institutions about what's the best way to use the very scarce resources, despite what we heard earlier this morning. The increase in availability of funds to the CGIAR is still a drop in the bucket compared to what we really need. So why do we want to do quantitative modeling for strategic foresight? Well, first of all, the question is, what do we mean by quantitative models? These are mathematical descriptions of biological and socioeconomic processes. We'll never capture all of the biological processes. We'll never capture all of the socioeconomic processes, and so part of the art of doing even quantitative analyses is to identify those relationships which are particularly important, but also to recognize that you're not capturing some of them and make that clear as well. But then we want to calibrate those models with real-world data. So part of our recommendations going forward is actually to combine the Foresight activities with the ex-ante evaluation with the implications for data collection efforts done by the CGIAR and other centers around the world. Why do modeling quantitatively? The world is a complex place. It's very easy to do back-of-the-envelope calculations and get things wrong. So we want to do those to capture the effects of interactions which are too complex to understand intuitively. We also want to take advantage of the fact that the costs of modeling are going down, but we also want to ensure that we do modeling when the costs are less than the benefits. We want to provide global consistency, hence the need to model the whole world, which can then provide inputs into regional and local modeling efforts. So what we'll be doing going forward, this is the proposal, is to have two different kinds of activity. Multidisciplinary center-based teams which bring plant and animal breeders, physiologists, soil scientists, and economists together to assess the technologies at these centers that scientists think might be possible to do. To ask the question, are they actually valuable given the scarce resources that we have? We'll also ask them to help adapt and improve the modeling that we do, including substantial changes in the way they collect data and undertake experiments. And then we'll have a second unit, we're calling it a coordinating unit, which will be designed to incorporate the results from these individual centers into models that integrate the biophysical and several dimensions in the socioeconomics. Make sure that these models are based on the science, the best science that we know about, and that they are completely transparent. Ensure that the models are available to everyone and can be used by different kinds of users, and of course provide support to the multidisciplinary teams. Outputs will be systematic, transparent comparisons of ex-ante evaluation of promising technologies under a range of plausible scenarios of what might happen in the future. We will be putting together these tools and not just using them ourselves, but making them available for the world. We're going to start this exercise with a food security conference that will take place in the second week of April in 2013. And finally, let me just say that we think it's critically important that in the end we don't do this. I want to work my way out of a job and let somebody else do it. So capacity building is going to be really important for what we're planning to do going forward. Thank you.
Mouse has disappeared. Did you still something to your previous? Can't find the mouse. Yeah, but even there.
Even that doesn't work?
Escape, yeah.
Escape is always good. Yeah. So we get rid of mine though, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let's see.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Erik Matthijs from Leuven University, and the case I'm going to bring is actually quite complementary, complements actually quite well what Gerald just talked about, which was a quantitative approach, because I will be presenting some results from a more qualitative approach from Europe. It's a European case study, and please bear that in mind, that it's about Europe, it's not about the world as a globe. So some of the statements that will come out of it reflects on a European situation, not on a global situation. The title of the report, as you can see, was Sustainable Food Consumption and Production in a Resource-Constrained World. Notice how we put consumption first and production second. I invite you to Google these words, and you will find them mostly in the reverse order. But let me first give you this quote. I'm sure you recognize this. Actually, we heard this quote yesterday in the opening plenary sessions, and I'm sure that all of you would agree with this analysis that by 2050 we will reach a population of 9.2 billion. And, well, basically food production needs to increase by 70%, is what you often hear. Is that really an inevitable path towards the future? Or is there some kind of underlying assumption, even an underlying worldview that translates a 30% increase of population into a 70% increase in production that seems to be necessary? The same institution, the FAO, by the way, also mentions there is a 30% of the food that is produced is actually lost or wasted. So do we need a 70% increase in production? So as an opener, that's the kind of question that we wanted to put in the center of our foresight. The purpose of this foresight exercise, it was actually the third in a row for the European Union, was to guide European agricultural research with respect to future orientations. But the final aim, and that was interesting, of the mandate that we were given, is to provide building blocks to prepare a smooth transition towards a sustainable agriculture and food system in Europe. And the client was the EU Standing Committee on Agricultural Research. That's a committee composed of member states and the European Commission, particularly DG Agriculture and DG Research and Innovation. As you can see, the time slot was very small, June 2010 to February 2011, and basically a team of 8 external experts, a multidisciplinary team, provided what was basically a meta study, supported by a working group of that standing committee. That was a very important input, and also with a validation through a stakeholder consultation workshop. The method, as I said, was a meta study. What we did was we scanned all kinds of foresight activities and academic papers in this 2-year window, 2009-2010. There was 200 documents. So in a 2-year time window, we identified more than 40, actually 200. Not all of them foresight, of course, but in some way informative to foresight, of course. The framework we used, and I think that was one of our major contributions that we wanted to make, is transition theory. It's a theory that's not yet part of global discourse on change. And I projected here a small figure about what this transition theory framework brings to the transformation of a social system. As you can see, the elements of a transition involves analyzing systems. It involves envisioning a future. It involves exploring pathways. And as you can see, there's more than one pathway here. It involves experimenting. It involves evaluation, and it involves translating or upscaling. And here you already actually, I think, recognize the various activities that are being done or informed by foresight. The emphasis, what was also the mandate we received from the Commission, was to focus on the effects of resource scarcity. And what we added as an expert team was basically discourse analysis. That is making implicit underlying worldviews explicit and see what the effect of that is on how actually we look at the world and how we look at the future. Of course, there's more results than I only have a 10-minute slot, so I'll just join a few qualitative results of this foresight exercises. First result is we did a systematic review of all the old known scarcities, but also the newer scarcities, climate change, biodiversity, and so on. What was the state of the art of evidence we have on that? And our conclusion was the sense of urgency due to resource scarcities is accelerating, but it's still relatively badly known because, as you can see here, we did a small exercise in seeing the interactions between various resources. And as you can see, it's a quite complicated figure. and we don't know too much about the interactions. We are still very reductionistic in our research methods, which means that we know little about the interactions, and the problem is that the interaction, for example, between climate change and biodiversity accelerates, is a nonlinear dynamic that we don't know very well, just as one example. A second result is that the way we look at the problems, but also the way that we look at solutions, differs fundamentally between a more productivity or efficiency-oriented way of thinking and a more sufficiency-oriented way of thinking. You could say that the catchphrase of an efficiency-oriented kind of thinking is producing more with less, whereas a more sufficiency-oriented way of thinking, and that's what I would like to emphasize, this is a European study where there's overconsumption, where I would say that less actually is more. Less consumption even means more welfare for society. So these two narratives, this productivity narrative, which tends to dominate still thinking in agriculture. So we looked at we use those two narratives as a lens to look at, are resources really scarce if you look at from one side or the other, and what kind of solutions do you put forward depending on the lens that you use. But we do urge that not a productivity or a sufficiency approach, but both approaches are very necessary, and even a synthesis is very necessary. There is no silver bullet solution, so that we really called here for a diversity of approaches. In the final part of the report, we actually described, or we categorized or clustered three of these transition pathways. One is consumer-driven, because we do think that demand is not as exogenous as we tend to think in, or as we tend to model in our modeling, especially in the richer countries. Much consumer behavior is shifting. Second set is, of course, the more traditional technological roadmaps that we have been looking at, but not only biotech, but for example also nanotechnology. And the third one, which we think is being under researched or underemphasized in Foresight, is organizational innovations. Look at companies like Danone or Unilever and what they're doing in terms of corporate social responsibility. And they really make big differences, also for poverty, but also social innovation and global governance. So to conclude, what I think we brought with this more qualitative approach to supplement, of course, the quantitative approaches we also need, is that, or the call for action that we would like to propose, is that to take into account often implicit underlying worldviews and also values, and to stimulate diversity. Because let's face it, one paradigm tends to dominate other paradigms, and even worse, excludes other paradigms from gaining resources, and is very successful in doing so. I hope there are some donors here. Secondly, to consider multiple pathways that may sometimes contradict each other. If I'm thinking about a biotechnology pathway versus an agroecological pathway, they tend to contradict each other. But some other pathways may reinforce each other. And thirdly, which I think is also important, and Gerald also mentioned the capacity building aspect, well, that's not only true in the quantitative sense, but also in the qualitative sense. So it's very important also to help stakeholders to engage into frame-breaking thinking, that is really questioning their own assumptions of current systems, and not only in future scenarios. Thank you. Are you doing it? Let's see.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to present this Foresight framework exercise for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm going to call it LAC. It covers from Mexico to Argentina and Chile in the south and everything in between, including the Caribbean. It continues work done for GCARD first. Was organized by Foragro, a consultation in the region. Now for this GCARD2, different institutions, including SIAT, IFPRI, IICA, National Agricultural Research Institute, etc., we got together to develop a Foresight framework, a network of stakeholders for this exercise. We had 2 meetings in IDB and SIAT. They are policy brief and the GFAR that Robin mentioned, a longer policy brief that we are distributing, and it's a longer document that is being revised. It's going to be finished at the end of this year. This exercise looks at Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole, but recognizing the heterogeneity, it will be further consultations to improve the framework and also to go to sub-regions, countries, agroecological zones, even products. The focus is R&D and LAC. The method is scenarios, but we talk about some other methods too. And the time frame is 2030, but there are discussions about shorter and longer term periods. The content includes a historical view of where Latin America is coming from. It's always important to see where you're coming from. And it has a discussion of future trends, 6 scenarios and conclusions. I'm going to focus here only on some of the conclusions. If you are interested, you can see the policy brief or the longer document. The first historical trends and future projections show that, of course, Latin American agriculture has an impact in the region. No? Its socioeconomic implications are far-reaching. But also, Latin American agriculture has implications for global food security and for global environmental public goods or sustainability. This dual role regarding food security, it can be seen in the fact that Latin America became, the red line is the net trade, the net food exports from Latin America that surpass the US and Canada. The others are net importers. And although we know that most of the food consumed is also produced locally, trade helps stabilize prices and quantities, and in that sense, Latin America and all the exporters help stabilize the prices and quantities at the world level. In terms of the global environmental public goods, Latin America generates, it's very important biodiversity, generation of oxygen, and so on. And several of the major food crops like beans, cassava, maize, potatoes, sweet potato, tomatoes, etc., have the center, the origin of diversity of genetic material is in LAC. The background for this dual role has been an important expansion of agricultural production. Now LAC, measured in constant dollars equivalent purchasing power, is about equal as the European Union as a whole, about equal as the US and Canada as a whole, 30% bigger than India. And this happened with an important increase in productivity, yes, but at the same time there was a clear expansion of land. 1/3 of all the land, additional land, agricultural land defined as FAO crops plus pastures, happened in Latin America. And since 1990, 2/3 of the forest lost happened in Latin America. This suggests an important trade-off, potential trade-off for the dual functions, and R&D is crucial to be able to manage those trade-offs. This agricultural expansion also took place in the constant of very unequal agrarian structures, where small farms and family farms are being squeezed out. Gender has very different roles in the food chain, and the urbanization of poverty. Because of all these trade-offs and that involve multiple dimensions, agricultural R&D in LAC must include, but also go beyond strict focus on staple crops and small farmers. Because if we want to really manage all the very complex interactions at the environmental level and the food security level, we need to have a more holistic view. The other conclusion, some of the topics to consider, the Foresight work also highlighted the issue of consumption that was referred by several previous speakers. LAC is the more urbanized region in the world, even including industrialized countries. Poverty is urban, And among developing countries, the double burden of malnutrition and excess consumption of sugar and fats and so on and so forth also happen in Latin America. So that's Latin America. On the other hand, we know that we have uncertainties at the world level. What is going to be the path consumption for meat? What these different values that were referred to, particularly in developed countries, may impact on consumption patterns like carbon footprint, food miles, fair trade, and so on. And finally, I wanted to mention the issue of aging, because usually the demographic structure is changing in a way that the gap between total population, pure numbers, and the adult male equivalent of that population the gap is getting bigger and bigger. Usually projections use the number of population, but if you want to project food consumption, you also need to consider the male food equivalent. And by 2030, the gap between these two numbers is, in adjusted numbers, is 500 million people less. And if we consider 2050, is 1 billion people less. So we have all these uncertainties related to consumption. Climate change, Jerry mentioned that for the same level of greenhouse emissions, global circulation models may give you very different answers for specific places. That's a huge uncertainty. What we do know is that we have more volatility, more extreme events. Therefore, the conclusion is to focus on building resilience and water management issues. Regarding agricultural energy, we know that the prices of energy and agriculture are related: production, transportation, processing costs. That we also know that there are a larger correlation or deeper correlation now and more links through biofuels, A, B, the fact that commodities are being used as financial instruments, and C, the impact of energy on climate change. The uncertainties going forward is the projections are usually very high prices for energy, which will lead to high prices for agriculture. But we can also have a scenario like in the 80s, and that will have important implications. Finally, the need of considering slower growth. All the projections look at high price, high growth scenarios. We need to consider other possibilities because if we look at the global, the convergence models, and this is the GDP per capita since 1900 to 1950 as a trend, 1950, 2011, actual numbers, and then projections using the socioeconomic, shared socioeconomic pathways of the IPCC5. And if you can see, they are all way above the linear trends. We speculate in our document about the reasons why the demand and supply side of the growth over the last decades may be unique and not repeatable. We have some other discussions related to these implications that lower growth may have for agriculture. In terms of methodological and institutional issues, we already heard that there are several Foresight methods. Each one has its own applications. We need to maintain a collective view about what we need to use. We need to also focus on multiple wins. Given the levels of uncertainty, it seems appropriate to use multiple win approaches like CIAT's eco-efficiency and similar ones. Those multi-objectives include higher yields, lower use of all inputs, including water and energy, relevance to family and small farms, resilience in the face of climate change, carbon sinks, and gender and race sensitivity. Of course, the challenge here is to develop metrics to consolidate these multiple criteria. Instead of institutional changes, we heard this morning, Latin America has a very developed institutional framework starting since the 1950s with the National Agricultural Research Institute. But now we also have a divergence between private and public. Public sector has been increasing a little bit investment, but has been concentrated in a few countries. Some of the poorer countries have been declining R&D, and we still, as a region, R&D expenditures are low as percentage of agricultural value added. In the paper, we also note the process of convergence of life sciences with physics, chemistry, mathematics, engineering, and so on. and the emergence of new interdisciplinary areas, which all these things have important institutional implications also for human capital that in LAC is getting older. So therefore, it's important to develop networks across countries involving public and private to engage local communities, help smaller and poorer countries, and also the crucial point is how to finance all that. Finally, the Foresight analysis shows that the world and LAC may be on a sustainable business as usual path. We need multiple interventions that go well beyond the scope of agricultural R&D or agriculture, or even like the American countries as such. However, a robust conclusion across the scenarios is that we need to increase the levels of investment in agricultural R&D and innovation in LAC. And that will have a positive impact on global food security and global environmental sustainability. We expect to continue in 2013 and beyond with the work of Foresight Framework in Latin America, strengthening and expanding the network that is being developed using quantitative analysis and different methodologies with different international, regional, and local institutions. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Well, thank you very much to the speakers. We promised you an interactive session. This is it now. We have microphones in the room. Is that correct? Okay. While we have you think about your questions, we have already some questions from the web, which I'm going to share. What we would like to try, and this is supposed to be an event about innovation, is that instead of just having the speakers answer the question, we would like you in the floor, the participants, to also make comments, what you think about what is being asked. So I'll just start with the first comment, which is about how to make sure there is impact, or at least measurable outcome after the foresight. So the question is, how do you ensure that foresight leads to something? Is anybody in the audience who wants to comment on this? This is coming from our colleagues on the web. Well, I don't see anybody there, so I'm afraid I'm going to ask our panelists. Oh, here, Hans Herren, over to you. Please, the microphone here.
Well, I think it's very simple. Those outcomes have to be picked up in policies. If there's no policy, nothing will happen. So basically, then the question will be, how do you get it there?
Okay, thank you. Good and short, that's even better. Now we have a question for Jerry, coming also from the web. It says, after the scenarios are due, do we feedback honestly, saying we were right or wrong? So the reality check on the scenarios. Jerry, please here. In the meantime, if anybody can give us a show of hands on the 4 sessions, on the 4 presentations, any questions? Can we see who wants to speak so that we get the microphone to you? Okay, microphone here, please. Yeah, over to you, Jerry.
So there's really 2 answers to that question, or I'm going to interpret it that way.
We don't hear you.
So there's 2 answers to that question. I'm going to interpret it as having 2 answers to that question. The first one is honesty about the scenarios, and I think that the purpose of the scenarios is not to try to forecast the future, predict the future, but rather give you some kind of plausible ranges of what future outcomes might be. In that sense, you could ask the question, how well were we in doing plausibility? And I guess one should expect to be challenged about that in 10 or 15 years, but I'll be retired by then, so it won't be my problem. The second thing, though, I think is more important, which is the question of if you're evaluating technologies that don't exist yet, then do you have a way to go back? Well, first of all, do you have a way to say that they are comparable? And that's one of the issues we're going to be focusing on, trying to compare very different technologies with apples-to-apples methodologies. But then the question is, down the road, 2, 3, 5 years from now, as the funding, which is the additional funding that we talked about, comes to a center or centers to do the work, how do we go back and make sure that they're doing what they said they were going to do, or if not, why not? And so one of the things about systematizing this process, as opposed to doing a one-off exercise, is that it does at least allow the possibility that you document what people said they were going to do, so you can go back and ask them again how they're doing. This is not necessarily just to do blame and shame, but actually to improve the process. It's both the process of how scientists think about how they're doing their technology development, and we shouldn't forget the outreach part of it as well, but also the methodology for doing the actual assessment of the technologies in the beginning.
Okay, learning about foresight. Please.
Yes, good afternoon. I was struck by the statement of Mr. Burgos. I also have a sore throat today, so I cannot pronounce your name. But anyway, he was saying that the farmers' organizations, I belong to a farmer organization from the Philippines, do not seem to be very interested in this foresight activity. And I think the reason is for a farmer who's just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, he cannot think about the future. He doesn't have that luxury of looking 20 years in the future, when if he cannot solve his problems today, he will be dead by then. So my point is, even as we try to anticipate the future, we should always also keep our feet grounded on the problems of today, of the small farmers. Fix the roads, access to credit, simple technologies. Let's not forget that. And the other point I wanted to raise was, for the farmer to go from point A now to point B 20 years later, it's not one big jump. It's a sequence of progressions. He might be a 5.5 hectare farmer today, and hopefully if the road gets fixed, he becomes a 1 hectare farmer, 2 hectare farmer, not only planting rice, but planting other crops. And they need different technologies at different stages of that progression. So I think when we try to look at foresight, what kind of technologies are needed, we have to be very flexible and not just sort of predict what farmers should be doing, because there will be many types of farmers under different conditions. What we probably need is a supermarket of technologies, where any farmer or any technician can go to that supermarket and pick the right technology at a certain point, certain place. Thank you.
I take that to be more of a comment than a question. I had a question over here, please. We'll take you next. Sorry.
Yeah, the question is to Dr. Matthijs from Leuven. I found it a bit ironic that on the same slide where you are talking about frame-breaking thinking, you made the connection between a biotech GMO world being ecologically not sustainable. There are increasingly groups saying that you can have sustainability and you can also have GMO crops. So I would like you to comment on that.
Okay. Want to give an answer? Microphone here for
No, that's probably what's not on the slide, but you may have misunderstood me. I completely agree with you. I mean, we did not take a position in the paper on whether one technology is better than another one. Quite the contrary, we point to different pathways, and different pathways can all lead to sustainability. So it's actually the reverse of that. So thank you for your question. That clarifies that point.
Okay, thank you. There's a hand over there. Yeah.
Well, first of all, my appreciation for the excellent presentations that we have had today. That gives us a lot of time for thinking and discussion, which we won't have here. But let me just say a few things. One of them is Mr. Nelson. I commend you for the kind of analysis that you are making now on these predictions using models. But we started modeling about 20 years ago exactly the same way you did. And we trained Monsanto and Shell and the Chicago Board of Trade in predictions with software that has been modeled by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, University of Hawaii, University of Florida. So we knew all of these things 20 years ago. Why did not the public sector take this and use this information? We are learning that this is being done now, 20 years after we were doing this with the private sector. Another thing that we have to realize is that in the studies of Latin America, as Mr. Diaz Bonilla just presented, excellently well presented, I would like to read in detail. I used to be a deputy director at CIAT years ago. I'm glad that CIAT is aiming at working in Latin America with these projections. There are differences in the different countries. For example, in Argentina, we have a difference. In Uruguay, we have a different situation, exporting countries, which are now becoming part of the world supply center. Other countries are in the necessity of importing, but at the same time, they're becoming exporters. For example, in Peru, my country, because of the extreme situation of dry deserts we had, the government invested in infrastructure, in irrigation projects. The private sector has come in and has developed an agriculture which is, if you can see valleys, about 40,000 hectares, with the most advanced agriculture in the world, all drip irrigated and exporting. You can see how the private sector can come in and change the situation if there is a basic underground political decision, which is improve the conditions for the private sector to invest. So we come back to this basic proposition. If you have technology which is available, it will be available only as far as the governments institute policies which allow the technology to develop. So this, I think, is the basic question we have to think in terms of the whole world, and not only that the technology is available and then hope that the farmers will
bring
take
it to a close, please. Yeah, thank you. I guess this is a broader comment. Any other here up front? Sorry, I recognize you just next after this one. Sorry. Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. A quick question and a comment. I'll start with a comment, and it's directed to the colleague from the Philippines. I'm afraid I happen to disagree with you. I mean, I think every farmer does foresight studies. Any farmer who's got children does foresight studies, but they're not the formal ones, and we've been doing them for a long time. So there is a difference, and I can give examples. So I think that's a bit of a myth, frankly, that people don't look at the future. The question, and it's to all the colleagues who are doing foresight studies, how do you deal with confirmation bias? We've talked about what you've got in your models, but the most important decisions is what you leave out. And I think that really drives where your models, where your foresight goes to. So a little bit of comment from you on how you deal with confirmation bias, your own and others. And the second part of that question is, how do you get to participation beyond tokenism?
Thank you. Can I have the person in the back? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My question or comments relate to Dr. Jerry Nelson's presentation. I must say, excellent presentation, all three of them, four of them. Now, IFPRI did an excellent study, rural Asia, in the 90s, using the 1990 as a base and projected food projections, both consumption and production until year 2010 and 20. Now, I would like to ask IFPRI to go back and do some ex-post analysis of that study. The study is Rural Asia. It was funded by Asian Development Bank, and it was an excellent study. And how those projections, made in the 90s are true today in 2010 and are expected to be true by 2020. So that might give the, some retrospective on the, visioning exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jerry, I'll have a couple of other points and then get back to you. There was another hand over here. Please. Yes. No, you.
Me?
Go ahead. Yes.
Okay,
sorry.
this is for Jerry also, and sorry, it's a rather technical question. You are modeling a stochastic process, and I haven't seen in your presentation how you characterize the probability distribution and the dynamic distribution. So in your results, you gave the point estimate, but I haven't seen, and in any publication, the confidence interval of each scenario. So when you say it's a 20% rate of return, could actually maybe 40 or 0. And if you don't give that variability, then how can you compare scenarios?
Thank you. Jerry, you want to respond to these couple of questions?
Well, let me take Let me take the easy one, the technical one first, which is that it's one of those things where you recognize the problem and are not sure how to go forward with it. So we do have, the problem is in some ways much greater than you indicated, because all of the parameters that we use have probability distributions on them, or at least potentially do. There's uncertainty everywhere. And so one issue is that, you could argue that uncertainty swamps any significance that comes out of the model. The solution that we have, which I'm just going to put air quotes around it because I'm not terribly satisfied with it, is to instead do a range of, if you will, point estimates that then give you not exactly a probability distribution, but at least a range of what we call or would like to consider plausible outcomes. But I think those things always need to be confronted by people other than those doing the models to see whether they think they're plausible. An example of that, I don't know if you've looked at our 2010 research monograph, where we have a series of graphs that show what might happen to calorie availability going forward in time. And all these models generate like 6 billion numbers every time you run them. And so trying to figure out what's the critical number to look at depends upon the question that you're asking. The question that I was asking was not necessarily focused on a particular part of this graph, but somebody else saw it and said, a consequence of what you said here is that a good part of the people living in the 40 poorest countries in the world would be dead. That's quite a significant outcome that we missed when we looked at it. So I think, first of all, humility is a very appropriate attribute to have for this, but sharing the results widely to get feedback to improve the modeling, and frankly also sharing the modeling methodologies in a transparent way is also useful. I don't know that that fully answers your question, but at least it gives you some thinking about how we go about this. To come back to the question about that study that IFPRI did in the 1990s, I want to first of all correct you on the attribution. IFPRI doesn't do studies, individuals do studies. And I think that's an important distinction. It comes out of IFPRI, and so it does carry a certain brand stamp associated with it. But it's individuals who actually do the work to come up with these things. I didn't happen to be at IFPRI in the 1990s, so I couldn't actually tell you what the results were. But I do think what's important for us as we think about this going forward in the institutionalization process is that we actually try to capture some of the results in a way that makes it possible to go back in the future and learn from them. I mean, I have no idea how good or bad the results were back in the 1990s if you go back and look at them today. In fact, the only organization I've ever actually seen do that, and it's pretty rare, is the Economic Research Service of USDA does this on occasion. And so I think it probably is something that we should all do more often. So anyway, that's a few comments on that.
Thank you, Jerry. Ladies and gentlemen, we already encroached a little bit into the coffee break. I would like to propose that you go for coffee, but be here a couple of minutes before 4 so that we can start at 4 sharp. We have a number of very interesting presentations, and we expect to do a lot more back and forth with you in the second part of this. So please be back here by 2 minutes to 4 if you can, so that we start at 4 sharp.